Welcome to the Snapshots podcast, hosted and run by the Global Health Working Group as part of the British International Studies Association. This podcast gathers the personal insights and interests of global health researchers through conversations with those at its cutting edge. My name is Christopher Long, co-convenor of the BISA Global Health Working Group, lecturer in international relations at Queen's University Belfast, and the host and production manager of this podcast. This episode, we are speaking with Nadine Voelkner, Associate Professor in International Relations at the University of Groningen. Great. Well, thank you so much, Nadine, for joining the Snapshots podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So I guess to begin with then, so what sparked your interest working in the area of global health?
Okay, good question. I was reflecting on this question, and I think maybe two things from like everybody who has kind of these, growing up and earlier years and so on. I grew up in Hong Kong, and, it's a very different kind of understanding also of health and disease and so on. And every time coming back to Europe, I really noticed, even as a kid, how there's a completely different understanding of infectious diseases and how we relate to it as well. So for the people from Hong Kong, they're for them it's normal to have to engage and deal with infectious diseases and so on. While there's much more of an anxiety in relation to that in Europe in comparison. Anyway, that sparked kind of an interest in becoming a virologist of all things. But that I kind of had to turn away from that. Anyway, nowadays I feel like I'm returning to those initial interests in trying to make sense of our relationship with viruses and understanding the whole, context and composition of viruses within, multi-relationalities. So that's, I think, how I would say what sparked me in becoming interested in global health.
Right, yeah, that's really interesting. Really interesting background, and the East Asia seems to be ground zero from a lot of these things. So yeah, that's really interesting. A lot of health issues and events. What have been some of the most important issues and questions that you've investigated in your work?
Yeah, I think I started with an interest in security, in particular, trying to understand this whole idea of human security, and from there leaped into health security, of course. So I started off with this whole security discourses and trying to understand health security discourses. That's where I started off academically. But I've kind of moved beyond that a little bit. Not that I don't appreciate talking about in what ways global health has been securitized, or in what ways security, better understanding of security will help us to also understand better how we can act on global health. I've still kind of moved away a little bit from that key focus to having an interest in understanding the microorganisms in particular. So talking about viruses, bacteria, and other microbes and what our relationship is with them. And that in turn also actually, in my opinion, deeply affects also the kind of diseases and the kind of health possibilities enabled in global health. So that's where I've kind of moved into now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think there's some overlaps between my work and yours as well, especially taking on like the scientific issues and looking at bacteria and virus. It's really interesting. You mentioned you have interest in maybe viruses and virology and stuff. Is that what drew you to these areas?
That's a good question. I think you're right. In my initial interest in virology and genetics and so on, as a high school girl, right, and earlier on after school, I think that kind of also took away a little bit the fear of delving into what is ultimately a very strange discipline that we're not really, comfortable with. Most of the people are not comfortable with looking at from a political science perspective or sociology perspective, and then having to move into the kind of hardcore medical sciences. That kind of also scares a lot of people. But I think in some ways I felt like, hang on, I was really interested in this, and why don't I also get a bit of a better understanding and delve into it again? And that kind of led to the various questions and research areas that I've been working on in the past few years.
Hey, yeah, it's really interesting. And in your work, has your work kind of revealed any preconceived myths or disconnect with ideas that you took into the field at the beginning?
I think probably the biggest, maybe there's at this moment two things that I would highlight. The first thing is the literature on the microbiome and understanding, also post-genomics altogether, how we should really also in political thought and political theorization and political understanding, and this informs also public health understanding, right? How we should really look again at the way in which the viruses and other forms of microbes actually connect and relate to other species. And by looking into that, it opens up this Pandora box of, well, if this is really the case, that we are, I don't know, some people would say walking viruses or walking bacteria, as we're full of, millions of bacteria and viruses and fungi and other microbes are on us and around us, then something is wrong with the way we understand both political theory and then also, global health and public health. So there's a need there to rethink perhaps and reconceptualize the kind of theoretical grounds on the basis of which we try to make sense of these issues. And that's one thing that and in particular in terms of my preconceived myth is definitely this whole virus is disease kind of approach. Thinking of every single virus in the world is actually an enemy to the human being and even other beings. I think that really opened up things for me to think beyond there. And it's been hugely interesting and actually rewarding to go down that pathway. Although I've also got a lot of resistance as I went down that road, but it's okay. Yeah. And I think from there, that maybe relates to this other question that I think you wanted to ask in terms of what are the most interesting and powerful theories and approaches that I've sort of used in my work. For me, also kind of thinking back in relation to this work on the relations between human bodies and other living bodies with the microbial world around us, I think also has also really, I've been very receptive to that because I've always been more of a systems-based kind of thinker, ecologist, political ecologist, who's tried to make sense of how actually, the way in which we're all kind of thrown into whatever construct that you could call it, an assemblage or an ecology or a system, we are co-constitutive. So we are actually, if I move my finger, then somehow I'm also affecting someone else or something else within that system. And I think that in itself has also led me then to look into quantum theories, also in relation to to global health, because that is a systems form of system thinking. And that's my current work where I'm looking at it. It's really trying to understand the way in which quantum physics, and now in this current years, in the last few years, quantum microbiology that has kind of moved over the quantum into the quantum physics into the quantum microbiology, how that is also, even if people are think it's very controversial and are not very convinced and are yet to see what's going to come out of that, it's still very interesting how there are also a lot of people who are actually also trying to capitalize on it already. So there's a lot of quantum microbiological research that is being done also in terms of vaccine development and so on, which kind of, I don't know, I'm not quite ready there in my head yet, but you need to kind of step back and think about, well, what is this going to do in terms of how we understand the human, the other living beings, and so on, and what does it mean for health and in particular also global health? So those are the kind of two main theoretical thrusts that I have been working on or am working on right now.
That's great. Yeah. So I think, that brings together really nicely the question that I had about the theories that you've used and also maybe the future work that you're looking at. So is this definitely a main focus of what you're going to be looking at in the future?
Yes, I'm definitely interested in understanding more, perhaps more on the question of the body. What a quantum physics, understanding of quantum microbiology, understanding really tells us about this figure of the human and whether we can still think of the human in terms of this closed, inert, and distinct and separate kind of being. And we cannot, if we look at epigenetics and we look at the microbiome, the microbiomics, and then we also think about quantum microbiology, we cannot think of the figure of the human as distinct from the rest of the world, from the environment within which the human or other living beings are being embedded. So, and that really raises very interesting questions, ontological questions, about how do we make sense of the place of the human in this world, also via other species. But then what do we do then in relation to global health, sustainability, sustainable global health? So how do we make sense of this? So that's the questions that I'm kind of trying to grapple at the moment with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know you mentioned like quantum theory is something that you've been focusing on in recent years, but I know you've also looked at maybe a few other theories beforehand. Could you just talk a little bit about maybe your theoretical journey and why maybe you think these quantum approaches are more valuable in contrast to maybe some theories you've looked at previously?
Okay, yeah, you're right. I think I started always with this kind of ecological or systems kind of based thinking. I started with a keen interest, started very early on with a Foucauldian kind of lens and the Deleuzian lens, which has led me into new materialist thinking, which I have tried to also utilize within my own work. There's this publication in relation to my work in Thailand, which tries to make sense of how policy constructs like human security, of course, don't enter a vacant field, but are formative of things that are there, but also that itself constitute things already within the field. So and that relates to materiality. So it's not just about discursive constructs, but it's also the materials that are kind of fed into this assemblage, which are utilized in order to make certain ideas work and others not to work, that are instrumental in understanding, for example, security politics. You need to understand what kind of a constellation of things and humans or other beings are within a particular system that then sort of co-constitute each other and then create something novel and new again. And there I looked at the role of the virus, for example, also how the virus itself is also giving rise to certain actions and certain materialities, which also explain the kind of assemblage, the composite of things and beings that ultimately make possible certain policies and relations as well. But from there, I have looked into more of assemblages, understanding in particular the role of microbial species in their relationship with the human, and how precisely the post-genomic sciences, so again, epigenetics and microbiomics and so on, they're really telling us a different story to what we know in public health policy, right? So that's really interesting to see how, if you give not a voice, but at least if you try to see an epidemic through the eyes of the virus or bacteria, come to a very different conclusion about how things have come to be. And so from there, of course, I would then argue, well, okay, if we look at it through the eyes of microbes, you see how actually they are hugely impacted, their lives or their being is hugely impacted by human infrastructures and human violence and actions, for example. And then it's no wonder that in turn, viruses and bacteria and other microbes are prevented from moving in certain ways or are kind of steered to move in different ways, which ultimately can lead to certain outbreaks and certain epidemics.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, really, really interesting how you take this perspective and how it's evolved over time. And really important perspective that we see overlaps with like the One Health framework, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Thinking about the interconnections that shape human beings that have maybe been neglected and for a long time. Yeah. Has there been any major surprises in your work that your work has revealed than maybe ideas that you set out to begin with? Or
perhaps one thing that I've been also looking at is the way in which global public health is very Western centric. It's because of the dominance also of biomedical lenses and understanding, which is not to say that biomedical approaches are in and of themselves wrong, because we know that many lives have been saved or pain has been alleviated also through public health actions in the past century. I'm not saying that. It's just that we also should be looking at other forms of healing and other forms of medicating outside of this more common mainstream kind of approach to medicine and approach to healing, and get inspired or even schooled in how we could do it differently in the way we work in public health. So I've I've delved into different epistemologies, non-Western epistemologies, to try and understand precisely that, just to see whether we can learn anything from other ways of thinking about healing that are also global. So I'm thinking here not just about, so in a way, taking a global IR kind of perspective to public health and global health, to look at indigenous knowledges, to look at East Asian practices, regimes of healing, or African systems of knowledge on healing, which in turn, again, is not meant to be saying that biomedical approaches are wrong in that way. I'm just saying that we can really both learn from those other systems of knowledge, but also we can perhaps appreciate more why a biomedical approach is maybe insufficient in certain cultural contexts. So that's I think where I've been most surprised throughout my journey.
Yeah, definitely. It's really fascinating how much this other side of things seems to be kind of neglected, especially in the mainstream discourse as well. Actually, and I think it's really important, really exciting work that you're doing that reflects these other ways of maybe approaching medicine and healing and ways we can approach dealing with and understanding disease outbreaks.
I'll give you an example, maybe just very quickly, which I found fascinating. A student of mine, a master's student of mine, was looking into ways of treating or of healing in earthquake victims in Indonesia. And for the lack of biomedical public health institutions, psychiatric hospitals, for example, because of a lack of funds, a lack of interest, for global health interests or whatever. So these communities were lacking the kind of Western forms of healing that were normalized and appreciated throughout global health regimes, right? And so she looked at, as a master's student, she looked at, local people, the Indonesians, were actually consulting with traditional healers to help them to deal with the trauma of disasters. And she found that actually the practices and the healing advice and so on that traditional healers were recommending and basically working through with the people who consulted them or came to them were actually very similar to the kind of practices of healing that psychiatrists were in turn recommending without the medication, of course. But it's interesting how there are parallels which we don't normally appreciate, that actually the practices can be quite conform and can be quite similar, and yet we don't appreciate that. The outcome then is the same, because it was also, the healing in Indonesia was also context specific. So, the cultural dimensions of community and family and so on were very important. And that's how you also can heal. But I think this is also beginning to be appreciated in the World Health Organization, I think.
Yeah, that's really fascinating and really interesting to see some of the overlaps maybe that we don't realize, and between maybe East and West and different ways of approaching, and that maybe become marginalized in certain contexts, but the links still remain. It's really interesting. And I guess to wrap up then, do you have any advice to students beginning their career investigating global health or global health security, or trying to investigate these issues?
And that's a good question. I hadn't thought about that now, actually. I think I would say that to any students, and not just students of global health, but any student, follow your curiosity and follow your, what excites you. And in particular, in relation, when it relates to health and disease and global health altogether, what is the subject within that field that is most interesting to you, that perhaps even you bring a personal experience of also into the field. So I think, be open and think outside the box, really. And don't assume everything that is said cannot be criticized, for example.
That's great. That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for a really, really interesting conversation, really stimulating conversation. Thank you, Nadine, for taking part in the Snapshots podcast.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Snapshots podcast. Please see the show notes for more information on our guest.